My brother forged Dad's deathbed letter. I proved it with a handwriting analyst. When Dad's $2.1 million estate was to be split evenly, my stepbrother pulled out a letter at the will reading. It gave him 75%. The handwriting looked like Dad's, but I knew he wanted equal. I had his chemo journal. A forensic examiner dated the ink, 4 months after he died. My father Joseph promised me the estate would be split evenly. After he died, my half-brother Brandon presented a deathbed letter awarding him 75%. The handwriting looked like Dad's, but I knew his true wishes. I hired a forensic document examiner to prove the letter was forged. What I uncovered about the ink was just the beginning of a secret my father had hidden from me for years. My father, Joseph, had always been meticulous about fairness. He built his $2.1 million estate through 30 years of commercial real estate, and he told me repeatedly that Brandon and I would inherit equally. Not because he had to, but because he believed in it. Half-brother or not, he always said family was family. Brandon was 9 years older than me from Dad's first marriage. We were never close. He moved to Vegas in his 20s and mostly called when he needed something. I stayed in Connecticut, visited Dad every Sunday, took him to chemo. When he passed in January of 2023, I was devastated but at peace. I thought I'd honored his final wishes. I thought the hard part was over. The will reading was held at Dad's attorney's office on February 5th. I wore a black dress and held a tissue I never used. Brandon flew in, looking tired and distracted. The attorney, Mr. Callahan, opened the file. He explained that Dad's primary will split everything equally. Then Brandon cleared his throat and said, "There's something else." He pulled a folded letter from his jacket, handwritten on Dad's personal stationery. I recognized the shaky script immediately. It was dated December 30th, just 2 weeks before Dad died. In it, Joseph wrote that he'd reconsider the estate, that Brandon deserved 75% for all he'd sacrificed. The language was formal but personal. I sat there frozen. When the letter was passed to me, I saw Dad's handwriting, but it felt wrong. Dad could barely hold a pen in his final days. His hands trembled from the chemo. He had told me just 3 days before he died not to let anyone twist his intentions. He was lucid then, tired but clear. "Equal, Rachel, promise me you'll keep it equal," I had promised. Now here was a letter that contradicted everything. I looked at Brandon. His expression was unreadable. Callahan said that if the letter was authentic, it could override the equal split. He advised a handwriting analysis. I told him I'd get one. Brandon shrugged and said, "Go ahead, it's real." That was when I first suspected, not the letter itself but his complete lack of resistance. He wanted me to investigate. Something was off. I hired a forensic document examiner, Dr. Anthony Reeves. Board certified, decades of experience, testified in over 60 probate cases. He asked for samples. I knew where to go. Margaret, Dad's longtime secretary, had meticulously preserved Joseph's chemo journal. She'd kept it as a record of his treatment, but I realized it was a goldmine of authentic handwriting. Day-to-day entries from his final months, written when he was weak but still himself. Margaret gave me the journal with tears in her eyes, saying, "Your father would have wanted the truth." I handed it over to Dr. Anthony, along with the deathbed letter. He spent 4 days analyzing. He compared letter formations, slant, spacing, but what he focused on was pen pressure. A dying man's hand can't maintain uniform pressure. The letter was too steady, too consistent. It lacked the tremor pattern of Joseph's known authentic entries. And then the ink. Dr. Anthony used chemical spectrometry to date it. The result stunned me. The ink on that letter was manufactured in a batch that didn't ship until April of 2023. My father died in January. The letter was written 4 months after his death. It was a forgery. I sat in my car outside Dr. Anthony's office, staring at the report. Forgery confirmed. The ink was too new. The pen pressure was too even. My half-brother had written a letter in Dad's hand 4 months after Dad died, and he'd presented it like a sacred relic. I felt sick and furious, and underneath it all, terrified. Because if Brandon was willing to forge a deathbed letter, what else was he willing to do? I called Mr. Callahan the next morning. I told him I had a forensic report that proved the letter was a fake. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Rachel, if this holds up in court, the letter is void. The equal split stands. But you need to understand, a forgery allegation in probate court is like throwing a grenade. It will destroy whatever relationship you have with your brother, and it will make the estate a public battleground." I told him I had nothing left to lose with Brandon. He filed the petition to challenge the will that afternoon. The probate court in Hartford scheduled a hearing for May 18th. In the weeks leading up to it, the discovery process began. Brandon's attorney, a slick man named Dominic Fury, requested copies of all the forensic work. We complied. I thought the evidence was airtight, but Fury responded with his own motion, arguing that Dr. Anthony's ink dadding technique was novel science and not widely accepted. He wanted the report thrown out. The judge, a sharp woman named Judge Alara Washington, denied the motion but noted she'd consider the admissibility at trial. The pressure mounted. Then Margaret called me. She'd been going through more of Dad's old files and found something unexpected. Not about the forgery, but about my brother. Dad had kept a personal ledger handwritten that tracked every loan he'd ever given Brandon. The list stretched back 15 years. There were entries for 20,000 here, 30,000 there, always with the notation "be gambling." Margaret's voice trembled as she read the last entry. October 2022, $45,000, B's casino debt, final. I asked what that meant, final. Margaret said, I think your father closed the door on him. He'd been draining his savings to cover Brandon's addiction for over a decade. That reframed everything. Brandon hadn't come out of nowhere with a greedy scheme. He'd been bleeding my father dry for years, and my father had hidden it. My father, the man who preached fairness, had been quietly pumping money into a hole, while Brandon kept losing it all. The estate I thought was a solid $2.1 million was smaller than it should have been because Dad had been hemorrhaging cash to protect Brandon. And now Brandon had tried to take what was left by forging a deathbed letter. The betrayal was even deeper. I hired a private investigator. Within a week, I had confirmation. Brandon's gambling habit was catastrophic. He owed over $300,000 across multiple casinos in Nevada, some to dangerous people. The investigator found records of his trips to Vegas doubling in the year after Dad died. It was like he'd been counting on a big payout. The letter wasn't just desperation, it was a calculated move to clear his debts and walk away clean. I felt rage reborn, but there was more. The investigator discovered that in the months after Dad's death, Brandon had made 2 visits to Dad's house in Connecticut alone. The housekeeper confirmed he'd been in Dad's study, the room where the stationery was kept. He'd had access. He'd had opportunity. The forensic report suddenly felt like just one piece of a much darker puzzle. I gave everything to my attorney. The case was building toward a knockout. Then on May 15th, 3 days before the hearing, my phone rang. It was Dominic Fury. His tone was different. He said he'd reviewed the forensic evidence in detail, and he was withdrawing as Brandon's counsel. He didn't give a reason, but I could hear the professional embarrassment. A lawyer doesn't drop a client days before a hearing unless he knows the case is unwinnable. That was the moment I knew we'd won the forgery battle. But the war wasn't over. The bigger question still loomed: who was my brother really, and what had my father been hiding? 3 days before the hearing, Brandon showed up at my front door unannounced. His lawyer had fired him, and he looked like a man who'd been hollowed out. He didn't threaten me. He didn't argue. He just stood there in the rain and said, I didn't know what else to do. They were going to hurt me. I thought if I just got the money, I could make it stop. I stared at him, remembering all the Sunday dinners he'd missed, all the loans my father had quietly written off. I said, You forged Dad's dying words. Do you understand what you took from me? He didn't answer. I closed the door. That was the last conversation we had before the courtroom. The probate hearing was brutal. Judge Washington had already reviewed Dr. Anthony's forensic report, the ink spectrometry, the pen pressure analysis. When it was my turn, I walked through every detail on the record. Brandon's attorney had withdrawn, so he sat alone, no representation. The judge asked him directly if he had authored the letter. He said nothing, but his silence was an answer. She ruled from the bench. The deathbed letter was declared a fabrication, invalid, and the estate would be distributed equally as the original will directed. I had won the legal battle, but walking out of that courthouse, I didn't feel victorious. I felt heavy. Because while the forgery was exposed, Margaret had kept digging. She found something else in Dad's study after the hearing. A sealed envelope in the back of his desk drawer, labeled "To Rachel when it's time." Inside was a handwritten note, dated the same week he entered hospice, and a separate legal document. The document was an unsigned codicil to his will, one he'd never shown to his attorney. In it, he directed $250,000 to Margaret, his secretary of 18 years, as a personal bequest for her loyalty. But there was more. He'd written about Brandon. He described his gambling addiction, the debts he'd paid, and his final wish, not to punish Brandon but to protect him from himself. He asked me, his daughter, to see that the money Brandon inherited would be structured to prevent it from disappearing into casinos. not as revenge, but as love. He called it his final act of fatherhood. I read that note and broke. All those years I thought Dad was just bailing out a deadbeat son, but he'd been trying to save him while still protecting me. The forgery was Brandon's desperate act, but Dad had foreseen that desperation. He'd known exactly what Brandon might do if left unchecked. The codicil never made it to probate because Dad died before signing it. Now, the equal split was enforced by the court. But I held the key to something bigger than the letter's forgery. I held the choice of what to do with the truth. I could have pressed charges: forgery, fraud, elder exploitation. Brandon would have gone to prison, the estate would have been protected, and I'd have been vindicated, but I kept thinking of Dad's words. Protect him from himself. My father had never given up on Brandon, even when Brandon lied and stole. I realized I didn't want to be the one who finally closed that door. So I made a decision that surprised everyone, including my attorney. I wouldn't prosecute. Instead, I'd honor Dad's unspoken wish. I arranged a structured payout through a trust. Brandon's half of the estate, roughly $1 million, wouldn't go directly to him. It would be held in a managed account overseen by a fiduciary with strict distribution rules: monthly living stipend, mandatory debt counseling, and direct payment to verified creditors. No lump sums. No casino access. He would be taken care of, but he wouldn't be able to destroy himself. And I'd carry out the bequest Dad had tried to make. Margaret received $250,000, just as that unsigned codicil described. When I told her, she wept. Not for the money, but because she knew Joseph had remembered her. She'd been the keeper of his truth, and now she was honored as part of his legacy. But the real reckoning hadn't come yet. The question wasn't whether I could forgive Brandon. It was whether he could face himself. The reckoning came on a Tuesday in September, 6 months after the hearing. Brandon had entered a residential treatment program for gambling addiction in Reno, a condition of the trust. It was a place called Second Start, surrounded by desert and silence. For the first month, he didn't reach out. I was told later he barely spoke. Then in August, he started writing in a journal. And on September 5th, a letter arrived at my home. Handwritten but not forged this time. His handwriting was shaky, honest. He wrote, "Rachel, I've been sober for 90 days, not just from gambling but from lying to myself. I sat in that courtroom and watched you not destroy me when you had every right. I couldn't understand why. Then I read Dad's codicil, the one you showed me. He saw something in me that I never saw in myself. I don't deserve it, but I'm trying. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm asking for the chance to earn it." I read that letter 3 times on my porch, watching the leaves begin to turn. The anger I'd carried since the will reading started to crack. Not gone, but lighter. I went to visit him in October. Brandon looked thinner, clearer. We sat in a small meeting room with plastic chairs. He told me about the years he'd spent hiding, the casinos in Macau and Vegas, the loans from men who didn't send reminders. He said he'd always believed he was one score away from fixing everything. Then Dad died and he panicked. He described the night he forged the letter at Dad's desk, using samples he'd stolen from the chemo journal, how his hand shook not from grief but from shame. He cried. I didn't reach across the table, but I didn't leave. That was the first brick in a very long bridge. Meanwhile, Margaret was living her own epilogue. She used the $250,000 to retire from the company where she'd been Dad's secretary for 18 years. I got a postcard from her in November, a photo of a vineyard in Tuscany. On the back she wrote, "Your father promised me this view. I thought he forgot. He never forgot anything." She never knew about the unsigned codicil until I gave her the money. She told me later that Joseph had once said, "If anything happens, Rachel will do right." I cried when I read that. Then came the final door that Dad had left unlocked. I was clearing out his house, preparing it for sale, when I found a key in the back of his dresser drawer. It opened a safety deposit box at the bank 2 towns over. Inside were old photographs, my mother's wedding ring, and a sealed envelope addressed to Brandon. Dated March of 2018, 5 years before his death. My hands shook as I opened it. I read, "Brandon, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you've finally hit the bottom I always feared. I have paid so many debts in secret because I believed the boy I raised wasn't lost, only sick. I loved you with everything I had, even when I hid it from your sister. Rachel is strong, but she has a tender heart. Let her in. I'm leaving you enough to start over if you choose to, but the money isn't the inheritance. The love is. Don't waste it, Dad." I sat in that bank lobby for an hour, clutching a letter he never mailed. He had written it years before the forgery, before the cancer, before all of this. He knew Brandon might destroy himself, and he still loved him. He also trusted me to find it. I mailed the letter to Brandon at Second Start with a short note of my own. Dad never gave up. Neither will I. A few weeks later, Brandon called. He'd read the letter aloud in his group therapy session. He said something shifted in him that day, not the addiction disappearing, but the self-hatred loosening. He began mentoring younger residents in the program. He told me he wanted to become a counselor. I didn't know if he'd make it, but for the first time I believed he might. Some families are born into a house of secrets. Others are rebuilt one honest letter at a time. My father left us both a final, unexpected gift, and it didn't come from the estate. It came from the truth he guarded until we were ready to hold it. Inheritance isn't just about money. It's about the stories we're handed and the secrets we uncover when we finally look. My father knew his son might betray him, yet he loved him anyway. He knew his daughter would fight for the truth, and he left breadcrumbs only she could follow. What I learned is that the real forgery wasn't just a letter. It was the illusion that some wounds are too deep to heal. I still talk to Brandon. Not every day, but enough. He's become a counselor now, working with gamblers in the same recovery program that helped him. He tells me that every session he leads is a way of repaying a debt that can't be counted. I believe him. Margaret is in Italy full-time, sending photos of vineyards and reminding me that my father's kindness was not wasted. I visit her when I can, and we share quiet stories that need no court to validate. The $2.1 million was distributed, taxed, and spent where it needed to go. But the letter I found in the safety deposit box, I framed it. Not the forged one, the real one Dad wrote to Brandon, full of unguarded hope. It hangs in my home office, a reminder that inheritance is not a transaction. It's an unfinished conversation we carry forward. If this story has meant something to you, please take a second to like and subscribe and drop your location plus local time in the comments below. I love knowing where in the world you're listening from right now. I'm Rachel, and this was the story of how a lie nearly stole my father's final promise, and how the truth he left behind gave us all a second chance.